Hi class, I wanted to use this time to talk about scientific racism and the way that race has been justified in this country. Race has been used as a tool of domination. There's a difference between race and ethnicity. Race was really a category that was defined by European explorers who promoted ideals of innate racial hierarchies. And these racial differences were used to conquest, to exploit different groups of people, to enslave Africans and other groups of people. And these racial categories are imposed upon groups, and they're regulated. There's a difference between race and ethnicity. Ethnicity is the ideal that hierarchies are not actually used to define ethnicity. Ethnicity categories are self or group designated, and the ethnic terms themselves are free from regulation. When we think about just how race is socially constructed, race is important because of the social meanings people attach to it, even though biologically there's not a true racial difference because people are humans. But the social context for race is how people define themselves and others based on physical and social characteristics. And these racial classifications serve to define, label, and categorize people into groups, and they serve as the basis for racism. That is, that these different racial categories are used to make certain groups feel inferior and superior to others, and to operate from that perspective. So scientific racism, again, emerged in response to questions concerning the morality of slavery, and it grew as the global abolishment movement grew out of the mid-1800s. And then what we see is that this whole scientific way of defining racism is not really scientific, it's pseudoscience. But Frederick Hoffman, in Racial Traits of the American Negro in 1896, published the extinction theory. He attributed the high infant mortality rates and high death rates in the black community to physical inferiority, and argued that any public or social investment in African Americans would be a waste of time. He also argued that Mexicans and Chinese immigrants were racially inferior to whites. And so this is the whole way in which scientific racism began to define, and we're going to talk about the eugenics movement. But this whole idea of manifest destiny and racial inferiority is the idea that it was the defined right of Americans to claim and occupy the land from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. This is when the United States was becoming what we know as the United States, when more territories were being taken over. And the ideology claimed that American Indians, Chinese immigrants, and Mexicans living throughout the American West were inferior, and this justified westward expansion. And they felt like the land in question, long occupied by Mexican and native settlers, were stolen in the name of freedom and American expansion. The eugenics movement came out of this whole way of thinking about what happened in America. It argued that the healthiest and ablest should be encouraged to have more children for the betterment of society. So during the early half of the 20th century, white birth rates dropped while immigrants and Africans increased, and this became a source of concern. Attitudes emerged. They desired to reduce immigration and force sterilization. That's how eugenics came about. It was thought to be in the best interest of society to sterilize the feeble-minded. And of course it was those who were of a race that was not white, or mixed racial groups, were considered to be not pure races. This is a picture from the American Eugenics Society of how they thought about people. This is a blow up of one of the main pictures on here. Some people are born to be a burden to the rest. And this is how they thought. America needs less of these people, right? The light flashes every 48 seconds. A person is born who will never grow up to be mentally beyond the age of 8. The America, on the other hand, needs more of these. The light flashes every 7.5 minutes for a high-grade person. So what they were doing is labeling people according to how they thought about who was the pure race. Again, this is not scientific. It was pseudoscience, but this is the way they thought about the United States and really the world as they started trying to categorize people. And it really became this context of thinking about racial fitness and how people are fit. Eugenics claim, when they, in an example of the Chinese Americans, eugenics claimed that a propensity to crime, pauperism, meaning you were poor, and disease was inherited. They warned that afflicted families would undermine American progress. So as immigration rates rose in the late 19th century, this view spread that immigrant groups, especially those considered racially undesirable, had higher rates of hereditary flaws. So this whole American Eugenics Society was formed, and what they did was they sent out all information about their beliefs. They did like the Fitter Family contest that appeared in 1926, and they argued that selectivity in human breeding and immigration would weed out those who were burdening society. This is a picture of how the Chinese Americans who were coming here to the United States, how they were aggressively searched for physical infirmities, because the idea was that only certain groups were fit to be American. This is another picture of a healthy family eugenic conference where they would go and talk about why it was important for families to not mix. And it was really just also a way to think about how racial mixing shouldn't happen. This is a chart of the states, and most people don't know this, the states that were sterilized and that were sterilized through eugenic measures. And these states with the lines are the laws in effect from January 1st, 1935, which there were laws in effect where people were sterilized based on eugenic ideals. And the darker states were states with bills pending as of January 1935. In 1907, Indiana was one of the first ones to establish a eugenics law. They believed that criminality, mental problems, and pauperism were hereditary. So the governor approved the first state eugenics law, making sterilization mandatory for certain individuals. And this became part of what happened. So the consequences of eugenics were enormous. Hitler used eugenic science in the extermination of the Jews. Involuntary sterilizations continued in the United States until the 1970s. It's estimated that more than 70,000 persons, women and men, were involuntarily sterilized. Sterilizations against women of color by the government paid physicians to do that in the 60s and 70s. And then in New York, Boston, and throughout the South, teaching hospitals performed unnecessary hysterectomies on Black and Puerto Rican women for that same practice. And then, of course, Native American women on reservations also experienced these sterilizations and were abused by the 1970s. And 25% were infertile as a result of these systematic efforts. So one example of what they found to think about that humans are really all the same is the Human Genome Project. They found that despite the wide range of physical appearances present in the human species, we are all genetically 99.99% similar to one another. And despite how people want to talk about racial differences, those racial differences are just differences that you see. They're not biological. So this whole project supports the argument that race is a social construction, not a biological or genetic reality. Thank you.